Hi, Mr. Fischoeder.
Hi, Bob.
If you're here for the rent, we don't have the checkbook down here. We also don't have the actual money in the bank.
Bob, it's okay. I was not here for that. I was just on my way to a brothelizer.
The Belchers are your typical family. A loving husband, his wife, and their kids living in some vaguely East Coast town and running their own burger shop. But despite being arguably the most wholesome and loving family in just about all of television, the family is seen struggling with their business throughout the entirety of the series. But are they really in such a dire financial situation where one wrong move could lead to some devastating results? Well, let's get into that and find out just how much Bob is actually worth. And of course, consider this your spoiler warning for a ton of Bob's Burgers. And hey, while we're here, comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. It definitely helps the algorithm not hate me. Before we get into Bob's history, let's talk about some meta stuff with the show as a whole. So, Bob's Burgers lives in a sort of floating timeline. We've talked about floating timelines on this channel before, so I'll try to keep the explanation brief. Basically, it means that time doesn't really move forward in the show alongside the time that passes in reality. Or that 1 year in real life does not equal 1 year in the show. Despite us seeing multiple Thanksgiving episodes, the kids and the parents barely age. So we'll have to do some messing with the show's timeline to make it make as much sense as possible. The first time we hear any sort of age mention for Bob isn't until Season 5's episode Father of the Bob. In this episode, we actually get a lot more backstory for Bob than we ever had before. So we learn in this episode that Bob is currently 44. Up until this point, we haven't seen a birthday for Bob yet, so we'll go back 44 years from the start of the series, which means that Bob would have been born in 1967. His mother died sometime when he was younger, and he was primarily raised by his father, Big Bob, and worked with him at his restaurant, Big Bob's Diner. This is most likely where Bob gets his love for cooking. When Bob was 14 and left in charge of the restaurant for a day, he tried to cook a burger his own way. This is the birth of the burger of the day, a staple at Bob's Burgers. This leads to Bob and his father having a big fight that culminates in Bob quitting the restaurant 10 years later when Bob is 24. But before we get there, we have to assume that after turning 18 and working for his father full time, that Bob was likely getting paid. So we'll officially start our math in 1985. We'll have Bob making New Jersey's minimum wage for each year he is working there for his father. While it's never directly stated that the show takes place in New Jersey, in the episode It Snakes a Village, when the family drives to Florida to visit Linda's family, the car clearly starts in Jersey. In 1985, New Jersey's minimum wage was $3.35 per hour. If Bob were working 40 hours a week, he would be making $6,968 per year before taxes. After taxes, he'd be left with $5,923. We don't know if Bob is still living with his father or not at the time, so we'll assume that he is as kind of a best case scenario. We'll take 20% of the $5,923, which is a little over than $1,184, and have him put that into a bank account where it'll gain an average of 2% interest. When Bob was 24 years old, he got into a big fight with his father and quit the restaurant. At this point, we'll have Bob move out as well and begin paying rent. We'll estimate that Bob likely had at least one roommate and was only paying $5,000 a year, which is the bulk of what he's actually making, considering that he is still likely only making minimum wage working in various restaurants. Around this time, Bob would meet Linda, who at the time was actually engaged to Hugo, the health inspector who hates Bob. The two of them would fall in love, marry, and open what would eventually become Bob's Burgers. While we don't have any exact years on when they get married and open the restaurant, we do have a bit of a window as to when they would. We know that Bob left his father's restaurant when he was 24, which would have been 1991 based on our running timeline. We also know that the restaurant is open sometime before Gene was born, which would be 2000. We learned this in the episode Father of the Bob. During some flashbacks, we first see Bob being berated from his father at the opening of the restaurant, and then being berated by his father for choosing the name Gene for his son. The order of these is very important. When showing flashbacks like this, they're typically done in chronological order. Doing otherwise can cause some confusion. So this gives us a 9-year window when Bob could have opened the restaurant. However, I think the restaurant would be open before Tina was born. I think that Bob and Linda would be much more likely to take a risk on starting their own business before they have any children depending on them. This shrinks the possible window for the restaurant to be open between 1991 and 1997. We'll have him open the restaurant in 1996. I think that it would be closer to Tina's birth because of how similar Bob looks during the restaurant's opening and Gene's birth. Now we can finally start talking about Bob's Burgers, the restaurant. I was able to find someone who did a bunch of the math for us, but I'll do a quick run through to explain it as best I can. The restaurant only has 4 booths and 10 stools at the counter. That means that the restaurant only seats a measly 26 customers. They estimated that the restaurant has 28 days of business and 3 miracle days where business is much higher than normal. Like in the first episode when a bunch of people show up after Louise tells her classmates that Bob's Burgers are actually made with people. On a normal day, they estimate an average of 16 customers a day, 7 for lunch, 7 for dinner, plus Mort and Teddy, and 40 customers on a miracle day. They also used an average of 31 days a month just to be a little more fair towards Bob. This means that on average, Bob's Burgers is pulling in 588 customers each and every month. From here, they do a few different combinations of what's on the menu and what people are likely going to order. Here's a hint, it's mostly burgers. After this step, they have an estimate of Bob's Burgers making $5,146 every month. Let's go ahead and assume that a lot of people are also leaving tips. We'll estimate an average of 15%. This will bring Bob up to making $71,014. Which is actually really good, but also not the number we need because this is actually gross income, which doesn't take into consideration any of the restaurant's overhead. They estimate an average of 30% of the revenue is going to the cost of goods, and that the actual restaurant is costing 8%, which brings Bob's income each year to $44,029. Which isn't terrible, but this is really the income for both Bob and Linda, considering they both only work at the restaurant. And while this does take into consideration the rent for the restaurant, I'm still going to be taking off what the rent likely is for the apartment above the restaurant as well, because even though it's in the same building, it could be rented out to someone else if the Belchers decided to live elsewhere. We'll estimate that he's spending around $20,000 per year on that apartment. So now we can go back, adjust all of these numbers for inflation, and start doing our math again until we reach 1998, when Tina, Bob and Linda's first daughter, is born. We'll be estimating that the Belchers are spending $5,000 per year on each of their children. We'll also have 1998 be the year that the Belchers buy their car. Their car appears to be a 1976 Plymouth 4-door station wagon. This car would be pretty heavily used at this point, but we'll still estimate it at around $3,500. We'll have them pay for this outright at this point. Coming out of 1998, Bob would have $18,371.58. Bob and Linda would continue on this way for the foreseeable future, with Jean being born in 2000 and Louise being born in 2002. For each of their children, we'll be taking away the equivalent of $5,000 per year for each child. So let's talk about the opening of the show for a moment. We see multiple banners going up in quick succession, ending with a grand re-opening. This means that the business probably had some major incidents occur, which would require some repairs. Though since they are renting the place, Mr. Fischoeder would likely assume some of the costs. Since we don't know exactly when these events would have happened, we'll sprinkle them a couple years apart after Louise was born and have it cost an average of $5,000 for each event. From this point, we can fast forward through to today. By this point, the Belchers would have $18,861.51. They don't own the building the restaurant is in, and they don't own their home, so we can't add anything extra on top of this. Which means that this is the final number for Bob. And honestly, this is about what I expected for the Belchers. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Follow me on Twitter at 10K Bill to yell at me about anything I may have missed. Support us on our Patreon if you like this show and want to see more content like it. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment related content.